or ever feel like you're just spinning your wheels? Like no matter how hard you try, you always end up back where you started, just a little more worn down each time. That's been my story for as long as I can remember. My name's Ethan, and if you've ever driven down Highway 17, you know it's littered with the ghosts of forgotten dreams and places time left behind. I was one of those ghosts, a drifter with no direction, no roots, and no real ambition, just a beat up pickup and a few bucks to my name. Years I spent drifting from one dead-end job to another, flipping greasy burgers and cleaning out fryers in sad little diners across the country. But nothing could have prepared me for the Blacktop Diner. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and I was running on fumes both in my gas tank and in my spirit. The stretch of Highway 17 I was on was desolate, just an endless black ribbon slicing through the darkness. My fuel gauge was practically kissing E, and I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. Then, a flicker of neon in the distance. The sign read Blacktop Diner, Eat or Keep Driving. The building itself looked like it had been ripped straight out of a vintage postcard and then left to rot. Paint peeling, windows grimy, and the neon sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly glow on the cracked asphalt. Something about the place screamed wrong, but desperation has a way of silencing your gut. I pulled into the empty lot, grabbed my worn-out pack, and stepped inside. The air slammed into me first thick, greasy, and stale, like it had been marinating there for decades. The diner was deserted except for an old guy standing behind the counter. He looked like he'd been welded to the place since it opened, face like a roadmap of wrinkles and eyes that seemed to bore right through you. "Help you, son," he rasped, voice like gravel grinding on gravel. "Looking for work," I blurted out before I could think. "You got anything?" The old man sized me up for a long, silent moment, then nodded slowly. "Ever worked a grill? Plenty of times," I said. Not a lie. I'd been cooking since I was practically a kid. "Can start tonight if you need me." He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that made my skin prickle. "Good. We've been needing someone." "But there are rules," I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he just shoved a spatula at me, bent and worn, the metal dark with years of use. As soon as my fingers brushed it, I felt something, a faint tremor, like the spatula was humming with a life of its own. The old man leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Follow the rules, or this diner will take more than your paycheck." He didn't waste time explaining the job. He just led me behind the counter to the grill, which looked ancient, almost like it had grown out of the floor itself. Grease stains tattooed every surface in the kitchen, and the air hung heavy with the smell of burnt fat and old oil. A flickering fluorescent light overhead buzzed like an angry hornet, throwing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. "This is it," the old man said, tapping the bent spatula against the edge of the grill. "Blacktop Diner's heart and soul." I raised an eyebrow. "Looks like every other grill I've worked on." He ignored me, handing me a battered notebook. The cover was sticky with grease, and the pages were yellowed and brittle, like they'd crumble if you breathed on them too hard. Scrawled in faded black ink on the inside cover were the words "DOUTB-CAKE-THERUS." "Read it," the old man commanded, his tone suddenly sharp. I opened the notebook to the first page and started reading. Rule 1 of the grill must always be preheated for exactly 5 minutes. Not 4, not 6. Use the timer on the wall. Rule 2. If a customer orders a burger, make sure the patty never touches the edges of the grill. Keep it centered. Rule 3. Never, under any circumstances, serve food to anyone who doesn't place an order. Rule 4. The clock above the counter will stop at 3:17 a.m. If it does, lock the door until it starts again. Do not look outside. Rule 5. If the grill starts smoking without a heat source, turn off the lights and leave the kitchen immediately. Wait 5 minutes before returning. Rule 6. At the end of your shift, clean the spatula and place it exactly where you found it. If you don't, you'll hear the sizzle even when the grill is cold. Rule 7. Never question the customers. Serve them and keep your head down. I looked up at the old man, trying to keep my voice steady. Is this some kind of joke? His expression didn't change. Those rules have kept this place running for decades. Break one, and you'll find out why. Find out what. But he just handed me a greasy apron and pointed at the grill. "You're on until sunrise. Good luck." Before I could argue, he turned and vanished out the back door, leaving me alone in the dim, creepy diner. I stared at the rules, my stomach twisting. Something about them felt deeply wrong, but I was too tired, too broke, and too desperate to care. I flipped on the grill, setting the timer for exactly 5 minutes. As the metal heated up, the spatula in my hand seemed to hum. a faint vibration that crawled up my arm and settled in my chest. I shook it off and got to work, wiping down the counter and getting ready for whatever kind of customers this place attracted. The first order came at 2:03 a.m. A man in a dark suit stepped into the diner, his face hidden in the shadow of a wide, brimmed hat. He slid into a booth by the window and spoke without looking at me. Double cheeseburger. No pickles. I nodded and turned to the grill. The patty hissed as it hit the hot surface, and I found myself obsessively centering it, keeping it far away from the edges. When the burger was done, I plated it and brought it to the man. "Enjoy," I said, trying to sound like I meant it. He didn't respond, just lifted the burger to his mouth and took a slow, deliberate bite. I went back to the counter, wiping my hands on the greasy apron, trying not to think about how his shadow didn't quite match his movements. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching out like an eternity. I glanced at it, half expecting it to freeze at 3:17, but it kept ticking. Just stupid rules, I told myself. Some elaborate hazing ritual. But deep down, a cold knot of dread was tightening in my stomach. By 2:30 a.m., the diner had sunk into an eerie quiet. The man in the suit had finished his burger, left a crumpled bill on the table, and melted into the night without a word. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement outside echoed for far too long, fading unnaturally slowly, like the darkness itself was swallowing the noise. Back at the grill, absently wiping down the counter, I noticed the spatula. It was still vibrating faintly in my hand, that same odd hum from before. Just nerves, I told myself. It's just another diner job, nothing I haven't handled before. Then the clock above the counter snagged my attention. I froze mid-swipe, watching the second hand tick closer to the top of the hour. 3:17 a.m. The rule about the clock burned in my mind. I couldn't look away. I told myself it wouldn't stop, that it was just some old superstition, but a cold bead of sweat trickled down my back as the second hand crept closer. When it finally hit 3:07, I held my breath. The clock didn't stop. It kept ticking, just like normal. I let out a shaky laugh. See, just stupid rules, I mutter, half convincing myself. Then the diner lights flickered. Just once, but enough to make my pulse jump. The buzz of the fluorescent lights faltered, and the shadows in the corners of the diner seemed to shift, creeping closer to the center of the room. I glanced at the clock again. 3:18 a.m. Everything's fine, I tried to tell myself. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the front door. Not a knock, just a tap, 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 like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. I stiffened, my hand clenching around the spatula. The rule about not looking outside flashed in my head like a neon sign. Don't look. Don't look, I whispered to myself. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and the tapping didn't stop. It just kept going, steady and insistent. The shadows in the diner seemed to deepen, growing heavier, pressing in around me. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. The spatula in my hand vibrated harder, the hum growing louder, almost like a warning. I stopped a few feet from the door, heart hammering, and forced myself to turn back to the counter. Rule number 4, I muttered, lock the doors. I darted back behind the counter, fumbled with the keys, and locked the door without looking outside. The tapping stopped the instant the lock clicked into place. But the silence that followed was worse. It was thick, suffocating, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I stood there for what felt like forever, clutching the spatula, staring at the clock. 3:23 a.m. My hands were shaking, and the buzzing in my ears drowned out every other sound. Then the grill hissed. Not the sound of grease hitting hot metal. This was sharper, more aggressive, like something was scraping against the steel. The spatula in my hand grew warm, almost burning hot, and I yelped, dropping it. It clattered to the floor, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a face reflected in the shiny surface of the grill. Not my face. Something else. I backed away, legs trembling, and stared at the grill. The hissing stopped, and the diner fell silent once more. I didn't touch the spatula again that night. The diner remained unnervingly quiet after the grill incident. I stayed huddled behind the counter, avoiding the spatula and keeping my distance from the locked front door. My eyes kept darting to the clock, watching each second drag by. It was nearing 4 a.m., and I silently prayed for sunrise to come, for my shift to end without any more disturbances. Then the sound of the doorbell chiming shattered the silence. My head snapped up, and I stared at the entrance. The door was still locked, no one had come in, but the bell had rung as clear as if someone had just pushed the button. Hello. My voice echoed in the empty space, and I instantly regretted speaking. The air felt charged, like the diner itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard it, a raspy voice from one of the booths. Coffee. Black. I froze. The voice hadn't come from the door. It came from a corner booth, shrouded in the diner's dim light. Slowly, I turned toward it. The booth was empty, but the coffee cup I'd wiped clean earlier was now sitting on the table, a faint wisp of steam curling up from it. The spatula vibrated on the counter, rattling like a tuning fork. I backed away, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The rule about never serving food to anyone who doesn't place an order replayed in my mind. Technically, this counted as an order, didn't it? But there was no one there. Just an empty booth and a cup of coffee that hadn't been there a moment ago. The coffee cup began to slide across the table on its own, inching towards the edge. The lights flickered again, and I saw a shadow dart across the room. Not a human shadow. Something wrong. It moved too fast, too fluid, like smoke sucked into a vacuum. Who's there? My voice cracked. The only response was the faint tap, tap sound, this time coming from inside the kitchen. I turned towards the grill, my stomach twisting into knots. The spatula was no longer on the counter. It was now lying across the grill, sizzling against the hot metal, even though I hadn't turned the heat back on. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing from all around me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take slow, deep breaths. You're just tired, I muttered. It's nothing. Just finish your shift. But when I turned back to the counter, the coffee cup was gone. In its place was a folded napkin, something scrawled on it in thick black ink. I picked it up with trembling hands and read the message, "Don't forget the rules." My blood ran cold. The rules. Had I broken any? I replayed the last hour in my mind, searching for any misstep. Nothing stood out yet. The message felt like a warning, or a threat. The bell chimed again. This time, I didn't look at the door. I just grabbed the spatula off the grill, ignoring the searing heat, and shoved it into the sink. The smell of grease filled the air, sharp and metallic, as I ran cold water over the metal. The lights flickered one last time before steadying, and the clock above the counter ticked past 4:00 a.m. For the rest of the shift, I refused to look at the booths or the grill. The spatula stayed in the sink, its faint vibration fading as the hours crawled by. By the time the sun started to rise, I was counting down the seconds until I could escape. As the first weak rays of dawn filtered through the diner windows, my nerves were frayed to breaking point. I'd spent the last few hours in a state of hyper-alertness, jumping at every creak of the floorboards and flicker of the lights. The spatula sat in the sink, silent and still, but its presence felt oppressive. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. Just as I started counting down the final seconds, a sharp knock echoed through the diner. It came from the window nearest the counter. My breath hitched, and I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. A man stood outside, face pressed against the glass. His features were pale and indistinct, blurred as if by fog. But his eyes were vivid, sharp, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He raised a hand and knocked again, this time with more force. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he pointed towards the front door. For a split second, I considered unlocking it. Anything to end this suffocating tension. But then the rules flashed through my mind, stark and unyielding: never open the door for anyone outside after midnight, no matter what they say. I stepped back, putting the counter between us. Saw we were closed. The man tilted his head, his mouth stretching into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He raised his hand again, but this time, instead of knocking, he dragged his fingers down the glass. The sound was unbearable, a grating screech that set my teeth on edge. The glass trembled under his touch, and I half expected it to shatter. "Please leave," I said, louder this time. The man's smile widened, and he tapped the glass with one long, bony finger. The lights in the diner flickered, and for a split second, his reflection in the window didn't match his movements. While the man outside stood perfectly still, his reflection turned its head to look directly at me. My heart leaped into my throat. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of plates. The man's reflection opened its mouth, and though no sound came out, I understood what it was saying. "Let me in." "No," I whispered, clutching the counter for support. "I can't." The clock above the counter ticked loudly, the sound echoing like a hammer against my skull. The man's reflection didn't stop moving, its lips forming silent words I couldn't understand. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would just disappear. When I opened them again, he was gone. The window was empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the diner's appliances. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A napkin lay on the counter in front of me, where there had been nothing before. Written in the same thick black ink as the previous note were 2 words, "Look closer." I hesitated, hands trembling, as I picked up the napkin. Underneath it was a faint outline of something pressed into the counter's surface, like a child's crane rubbing. I tilted my head to make sense of it. It was a face. My face, etched into the counter, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. The spatula in the sink buzzed to life again, vibrating violently against the metal. I stepped back, legs shaking, and pressed my back against the wall. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. The napkin in my hand crumpled as I stared at the distorted face, etched into the counter of my face. The air in the diner seemed to thicken, pressing down on me like a weight. I needed to get out of there. But something deep in my gut told me the diner wouldn't let me leave. Not yet. A loud clank broke the silence, and I spun toward the sound. It came from the freezer in the kitchen. The heavy metal door trembled, and frost-coated hinges groaned, as if something or someone was trying to force it open from the inside. I edged toward the kitchen, each step hesitant, deliberate. My shoes squeaked against the tile floor, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. When I reached the freezer, the door was still. No movement, no sound, just the faint hum of the motor working overtime to keep the temperature low. I reached for the handle, my fingers hovering inches away. The rules flashed through my mind. Never open the freezer unless the temperature dial reads exactly 0°F. I glanced at the dial. The needle hovered at 10°F. Relief washed over me, an excuse not to open it. But then the knocking started, faint at first, a dull thud from within the freezer's depths. I froze, my heart racing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it turned into full-blown pounding. The metal door rattled in its frame, the handle vibrating under the force. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. The pounding stopped instantly. Silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. Then a voice, hoarse and ragged, whispered from behind the door, "Let me out." I backed away, shaking my head. "No, I can't." The voice changed, becoming deeper, more guttural. Ethan opened the door. It knew my name. I clutched the counter for support, my knees threatening to buckle. "You left me in here," it growled. "Don't you remember?" The spatula in the sink clattered to the floor, and the lights in the diner dimmed. My eyes darted to the dial again, hoping for a miracle. The needle hadn't moved. "Ethan." The voice was loud now, reverberating through the kitchen like a low growl. "You can't leave until you fix what you've done." "I didn't do anything," I shouted, my voice shaking. The freezer door buckled outward, as though something massive was throwing itself against it. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The spatula began to vibrate violently on the floor, the sound blending with the freezer's groans. Then everything stopped. The freezer door fell silent, the spatula stilled, and the lights returned to their usual dim glow. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure whether to move or stay frozen in place. On the freezer door, frost had formed words. "Stark and clear, you're next." The frost on the freezer door began to melt, the words "you next" smearing into unreadable streaks of condensation. My breathing was shallow, the air around me thick and cold. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the diner itself was holding me in place. Finally, I tore my eyes away from the door and backed out of the kitchen. My legs felt weak, and my hands trembled as I clutched the edge of the counter for support. I needed answers. Anything to make sense of what was happening. But the diner wasn't going to give them to me easily. The spatula lay on the floor where I'd dropped it, its metal glinting faintly in the dim light. I hesitated before picking it up, half expecting it to burn me or start vibrating again. Instead, it felt cold and lifeless in my hand. Too lifeless. I glanced around the diner, my gaze landing on the notebook Silas had left behind on my first night. I grabbed it and flipped through the pages, hoping for something, anything, that might explain the rules, or the strange occurrences. Most of the pages were blank, but near the back I found a set of notes scrawled in shaky handwriting. The diner isn't just a place. It's alive. It feeds on those who don't follow the rules. The spatula is the key. It's the tether. Lose it and you're done. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the notebook so tightly the edges of the paper began to crumble. The spatula hummed faintly in my other hand, as if it were agreeing with the words. Another entry caught my eye. They don't leave. Those who break the rules, they become part of it. Listen for the humming. When it stops, it's already too late. The words sent a chill down my spine. My mind flashed back to the man in the window, the coffee cup that appeared from nowhere, the shadow that didn't match its owner. Were those the ones who had broken the rules? My stomach twisted at the thought. The jukebox started playing again, a scratchy, distorted tune that sent goosebumps crawling up my arms. It wasn't a song I recognized. The melody was slow and haunting, each note hanging in the air like a warning. I looked towards the corner where the jukebox stood. It wasn't even plugged in. Ethan. The voice came from right behind me. I spun around, the spatula raised like a weapon. No one was there. The diner was empty, the booths and tables bathed in the pale glow of the flickering lights. But I knew I wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen but undeniable. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging on like an eternity. My eyes flicked to it and I froze. 3:17 a.m. The second hand stopped. The diner fell silent. Even the jukebox's haunting melody faded into nothingness. I backed away from the counter, my heart pounding. The notebook slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The spatula began to hum again, the vibration travelling up my arm and into my chest. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles turning white. Then the knocking started. Not from the front door this time. It came from the freezer. "Let me out," the voice growled, low and guttural. "You left me in here, Ethan. Don't you remember?" I shook my head, stepping back until my back hit the wall. I didn't. "I don't know what you're talking about." The freezer door rattled, the hinges groaning as though they were about to give way. The spatula in my hand grew warmer, the hum intensifying until it felt like my bones were vibrating. The lights flickered violently, plunging the diner into brief bursts of darkness, and then, with one final, deafening crash, the freezer door burst open. The freezer door slammed open with a force that shook the entire kitchen. The sound reverberated through the diner, cutting through the oppressive silence like a thunderclap. A wave of freezing air poured out, chilling me to the bone. The smell hit me next, a mix of rotting meat and something metallic, like rusted iron. My legs refused to move as a figure stepped out from the darkened freezer. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long. Its skin stretched thin over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Its head was tilted to one side, and its face a god. Its face was a patchwork of twisted features, like someone had tried to sculpt a person out of melted wax. The thing's eyes locked onto mine, empty sockets that burned with an unnatural light. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. When it spoke, its voice was a rasping echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Ethan," it hissed, drawing out my name like it was savouring the sound. "You didn't follow the rules." My grip on the spatula tightened. "I did," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I followed all of them." The creature laughed, a hollow, bone-rattling sound. "Not all of them." I racked my brain, desperately trying to remember if I'd missed anything. The rules were burned into my memory: the grill, the spatula, the doors, the freezer, but there was nothing I'd broken. I was sure of it. "Why me?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the creature tilted its head further, its neck creaking like an old door hinge. "It's not about you," it said. "It's about the diner, and the diner never lets go." The lights flickered again, plunging the room into bursts of darkness. Each time the lights came back, the creature was closer. First, it was standing in the doorway. Then it was by the counter. Finally, it was right in front of me, its full breath freezing against my skin. I swung the spatula instinctively, the metal slicing through the air. The creature recoiled slightly, hissing, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it reached out with one long, clawed hand and grabbed the spatula. The vibration in the metal intensified, travelling up my arm and into my chest. I screamed as a searing pain shot through my body, like the spatula was burning me from the inside out. "You can't fight it," the creature whispered, its voice laced with dark amusement. "This place if it owns you now." I collapsed to my knees, the spatula falling from my hand. The creature loomed over me, its grin widening. It leaned in close, its breath icy against my ear. "You'll join the others," it said, "just like Silas." The realization hit me like a freight train. Silas, the old man who had hired me, who had given me the rules. He wasn't just a worker. He was part of the diner. Just like the others, the man in the window, the shadows, the whispers. They were all pieces of the diner, remnants of people who had failed to follow the rules or had been consumed by the diner's insatiable hunger. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I won't become like them." The creature laughed again, a sound that made my blood run cold. "You already are." The spatula began to hum again, louder this time, until it drowned out every other sound. The lights flickered violently, and the diner seemed to twist and shift around me. the walls closing in like a living thing. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. The diner was silent, the lights steady. The freezer door was closed, and the spatula was back on the counter, gleaming as if it had never been touched. But something was different. The clock above the counter read 1100 p.m., the exact time I had started my first shift. I stumbled to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. I turned back to the counter and saw it a new notebook, clean and unblemished, sitting next to the spatula. My name was scrawled on the cover in black ink. I opened it, my hands shaking. The rules were the same, but the last page had a new addition. Rule 8: train the next hire. Pass on the spatula. If you fail, the diner will take you instead. A sharp knock at the door made me jump. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Outside, a young man stood, his face weary and desperate. He looked exactly like I had on my first night, lost, tired, and out of options. Help wanted, he called, his voice muffled through the glass. The diner's lights flickered, and the spatula hummed softly on the counter. I didn't want to open the door, but I knew I had no choice. The diner doesn't let go. The young man stepped inside, looking around nervously. I handed him the spatula and forced a smile, the weight of the diner's curse settling onto my shoulders. "Welcome to the Blacktop Diner," I said. "Follow the rules, and you might just make it through the night."